All right, got another video for you. It'll be a mixture of gameplay and hopefully just a quick discussion in the beginning. I made one change to the deck. I like a recommendation somebody made in my comments. I was asking the question, should I run Archmage's Charm? Was something that I was internally on the fence about, and the question I was asking is, what card should I cut for Tail's End? And the suggestion was this card for this one. And considering that that already kind of corroborated the assumptions that I had, which was that, so Archmage's Charm is backbreakingly powerful if you steal a Soul Ring. Basically, a control magic effect is almost always a 2-for-1. If you can imagine, real quick thing on control magic effects. So imagine if your opponent has 2 cards in hand. They've got, it doesn't matter what they are for the purposes of this discussion. Let's say they have one card which is a permanent and one card which can destroy that permanent. So it could be a Weathered Wayfarer and a Swords to Plowshares. It could be a Soul Ring and a Disenchant. So it doesn't matter, right? So one card is a permanent, one card destroys a permanent. They play the permanent. You steal it. Now they've used a card and you've used a card. The net result is you now have a permanent. So you've traded a card for card to destroy, from their perspective, their card. So they're down a card. But you're down a card because you've got an Archmage's Charm in the graveyard in order to be up a permanent in play. So for you, it's a break even. For them, they're -1 card. Now they have to disenchant their own Soul Ring or Swords to Plowshares, their own Weathered Wayfarer or whatever. So they have to destroy their own card that you stole. So that at the end of it, and you lose the thing you had in play. So when they play that second removal spell, they go down a card, you go down a card. So the net result is you are -1 cards and they are -2 cards, right? So it was their Soul Ring. You steal it, and then they disenchant their own Soul Ring. So they're down 2 cards, you're down 1. So any control magic effect is a 2-for-1. The fact that this can also draw 2 cards is a reverse 2-for-1. So 2-for-1s where you remove 2 of their cards for 1 of yours, like in this Archmage's Charm example, or in an example where you say a less subtle example is the one where you can destroy. I think it's choose 2 on it. Let's see if I've got it. Yeah, Mulligan's Command. So for example, you destroy one of their cards and then make them discard a card, or you deal 2 damage to something, destroy something. That's a little less subtle, right? It's a little more obvious. But you can look at an Archmage's Charm as a blue Mulligan's Command equivalent. And when you think about it that way, the fact that K-Command can also return a creature from your graveyard to your hand, but has no other way to get a second card into your hand where Archmage's Charm can. And then, of course, the fact that K-Command's limited in what it can exchange with, where Archmage's Charm can choose to go on a 1-for-1 exchange and just stop anything, means that ultimately, in terms of the effect, Archmage's Charm is a better card than K-Command, and K-Command is a very good card, right? It's a card you generally will play in those colors, or you should have thought about playing in those colors anytime you're touching them. I've certainly thought about playing that card in here. Well, Charm falls into the same position. However, at triple blue in this 4-color deck, it is, even though blue's the main color, blue, for a deck that wants to use its first turn to tutor up a Mana Crypt or a Soul Ring, is not really consistently playable until much later in the game. On the other hand, Tail's End is consistently playable sometimes as early as turn 1. And while Charm can win a game if you steal an early Crypt or Soul Ring, just with a huge tempo swing, the same way that Dack Fayden will win a game just boom on the spot. A lot of times Dack Fayden ends up stealing talismans. Charm can't do that. Dack Fayden's easier to cast. You can cast it on turn 2 off a turn 1 Soul Ring, for example. Charm can't do that. So there's a lot of things that make the cards not quite equivalent. Of course, Dack Fayden's reusable in a Planeswalker and whatnot. But in terms of, like, yes, the effect can win, but you're going to wait on it. And the problem is, if you're waiting to deal with a Soul Ring or a Crypt, well, you might have lost the game by the time you steal it. Now it's not so backbreaking and it doesn't matter as much. So I think this is a card that in a deck like Nin, for example, that would where Soul Ring and Crypt are massive threats, and the deck is almost pure blue with just a tiny little amount of red, this card's gotta be correct. But in a deck like this, where it's a redundant effect, you've already got like disenchant and things to deal with Soul Rings, so you're not the theft of a 1 mana permanent or less is not that big of a deal for this deck. Uh, and the fact that you probably will have to wait till turn 4 or 5 before you can play it in most games probably means the card doesn't actually belong. So it's painful because I really wanted the card to be in the deck because the effect is so nice. It's along the lines of a Cryptic Command in terms of, counter and draw, or draw 2, or steal, in terms of value. And so if you look at it this way, it's a reduced cost Cryptic Command in value. But Cryptic's incredibly flexible and a card you can wait on, and a card that can function as a massive life gain when, for example, your opponent has a giant army and you tap the army and buy another turn, or they have a huge threat and you bounce the threat, buy another turn. Charm doesn't have that kind of flexibility, so Cryptic you don't mind waiting to play, and you don't need to play it on turn 4. You can play this thing on turn 15 and it's still always a card that is great when you resolve it, or makes you happy to resolve. Turn 15, this is going to be like, draw 2 cards, look at them, hope that they save you. Hope one of them's Cryptic, right? So, doesn't quite have the same punch, and so for that reason, Charm is out. Tail's End, on the other hand, that does make the cut, but I wasn't going to look at Charm as hard if it weren't for the comment that, I had these feelings in the back of my head about, as far as, because I kept having these games where I would draw Archmage's Charm and I would have blue, blue, and a colorless, or, blue, blue, and I'd have blue, blue Plateau or something, right? And so my mana appeared to be pretty good, but, wasn't great. I'd have Underground Sea, Tundra, Plateau, or something. And so Charm, on the other hand, so getting back to that, it has the flexibility to deal with the fact that it can counter commanders on turn 2 is really, really good, because there are a lot of commanders that you just don't want in play at all, and you really do need to counter most things on turn 2, because green is a color. And because green is a color, and your opponent can go, you go land and they go first turn elf, and then you go land and they go second turn commander you need to counter. Charm fits that role. It functions as a mana leak in that role, or a remand to buy time, or a counter spell. Like, you can see how important it is to deal with things like that early, or occasionally, of course. And if you can't, Muddle's in here for a different reason. It's a counter at 2, but it's got a whole different function. You treat Muddle as a sort of mini demonic tutor, so that's which just so happens to have a counterspell mode on it. But in addition to dealing with, to giving us a 5th way to deal with, and of course there's this guy, 6th way if you want to look at it that way, to deal with an early commander, beyond having to have removal, right? So beyond that, and early commanders being such a threat, you can see like many solutions is the preferred route. Tail's End also has the interesting ability to counter a strip mine effect. So it's not going to be countering a turn 1 strip mine, but the fact that you can deal with a turn 2 is still really good. Can be really good anyway. It can also function as a counter for a fetch land. So the more powerful decks, the ones that are going to be blue X colors running multiple fetches, this actually gives you an edge in the matches that matters the most. So that's pretty interesting. Of course, it can also do some spiffy things, like you can deal with a Planeswalker Ultimate, for example. Not necessarily going to win you the game, because if their Planeswalker's been there long enough to ultimate, you're probably in big trouble. But there could be some scenario where Well, a best example might be Tezzeret the Seeker. Somebody throws down a Tezzeret, uh, you can't address it right away. So they plus it up and untap some mana sources. On the next turn, you play a land and say pass, and then they activate Tezzeret for 5, and you tails end it, where they were going to go get their, whatever costs 5, Batterskull, Gilded Lotus, or something, right? And so you kill a Tezzeret, or maybe they activate it for 4 on the next turn, and even that's still really good because you buy yourself a lot of time. So that kind of flexibility is really nice to have. The fact that you've just got that threat is interesting, I think. And, there's a few other things it can do that aren't great but are good enough. Like you can't counter a Snapcaster, but you can counter the Snapcaster's come into play ability to prevent it from flashing things back. The fact that this also counters legendary spells, and they've made Planeswalkers legendary, means you've got a 2-drop counter spell for Planeswalkers, as well as the opposing commander. So, in all those reasons, I think Tails In is probably the better card for this deck, but Archmage's Charm belongs in a deck that's more heavily blue. Any 2 or 1, obviously mono blue or 2-color deck like Nin, Charm probably fits or belongs in. I'd go so far as to say. And then maybe your 3-color decks, although that's pushing it. Triple blue, it's a big ask. The only reason I can run a card that's off-color triple black is because this card says, BBB, you win the game in almost every game that it's played. And there's the land specially printed to support it, and we have fetches for that land. And of course there's the Lotus, but the main thing is, the Lotus would power a charm, but these cards do not. So I've always wished they would print in Legendary Island that turned all your lands into islands. God, that would be so good. Anyway, games. Let's take a look at some gameplay. Hopefully I didn't bore you too long with the discussion, but I will add a skip link in the description. So if you've taken advantage of that, you will be jumping ahead to where we're coming up to right now. So looking at all results for the last 7 days, you can see it's been pretty good. And I will probably just start with games from the 7th here. Well, I don't know what games. I kind of want to like fit as many games in, but I've been running in this issue, and I don't know what's going on with people online, but running in this issue where they join my games and then they quit right away. So I haven't scoured through these to eliminate the number of times that happened. So I will apologize in advance for the games that just end without being played. But unfortunately, it's the cost of playing online. I did go ahead and change my avatar. Where the heck is the avatar? Here, if I create a game, there. You see I've got the evil eyes, which, if you know which card that comes off of, it's actually, you gain control of your opponent for a turn. So I'm trying to tell people, hey, look, I'm not playing to be a nice guy, and I am playing a control deck just with my avatar. I doubt anyone reads into that far as I do, but maybe after the game they'll be a little less upset if they lose to somebody with evil-looking control eyes playing an evil control deck. So anyway, I'll just start on the 7th with Obsessive Python, and we'll see what happens as we move forward through time, but some of these games will just be throwaways. Anyway, my opponent here is playing Sliver Hive Lord, and I've got a start that goes from really good to great. So I tutor up a Mind Twist right away because the thing about this deck is they want to accumulate a massive number of slivers and then kill you with their combined synergies. So my thought is, what I want to do is I want to make it very difficult for my opponent to do that. So I'm going to lead off with a tutor for a Soul Ring and then a twist on 2. And the reason I'm wasting a twist early on 2 is because I have a will and I have a way. So I'm going to go ahead and dump my opponent's hand completely at this point. And then I'll use Breya to clean up the mess afterwards, is basically the idea here. So I'm taking some beatings. I'm not blocking because the slivers have flanking, so if I block, my Spellseeker just becomes a 0/0 with no abilities and dies before damage is dealt. And I'd rather just do what I just did, use Breya to kill the one that gives him flanking, and now if my opponent wants to attack, I can actually trade this in for value, or later on in the game, I have the potential to either recur it or with something like bouncing with my own Jace if that comes up, or more frequently grab a Skull Clamp somehow with, say, a Trinket Mage or whatever, and draw some cards off of it. So it wasn't worth it for me to just prevent one life to throw away a resource like that, at least not at that point in the game. But here my opponent concedes, and obviously the game's over. They draw a card, probably would have played one more turn if they had land. Sliver Hive Lord would have attacked. I would have lost one life. I would have just blocked with something like this. The creature wouldn't have died. And then on my turn, I would have played Teferi, tucked their commander, and I imagine at that point they would have conceded anyway, so no big deal. So we move into game 2, and I don't know if it was played out or not. Yeah, I guess so. Kemba Ka Regent is the commander this time. Same opponent. I'm sorry, I've been sick, which is part of the reason I haven't played much and part of the reason I've been making videos. But with that long break that I had, I've been trying to get back onto the habit of making videos a little more frequently. So anyway, my opponent has a heck of a start, but one thing that so in unfair older formats, like, I'll pause for a second. Unfair, right? Older formats where the card pool was relatively balanced. So where you had like Moxes and Black Lotus and Soul Ring, yes, you had Ancestral Recall and Time Walk and whatnot, but you didn't really have the kind of, you weren't, there were no Storm cards that existed back then. So like in old school, right? One of the things that made the deck the most powerful deck was Mana Drain. Actually, it was one of it's the best counterspell in the game by far, and it would give that deck the ability to sort of judo you by stealing, countering, stealing your mana, reversing the force that you put into that turn and turning it against you. But what's interesting is when that deck faced itself, or when that deck faced absurd starts. So sometimes, because of all the power and stuff, your opponent might do something crazy, like they would go, land, Soul Ring, Mox, Elf, Mana Elf. You've gone land, they go land, Soul Ring, Mox, Mana Elf, and then on the next turn they're getting ready to play Shivan Dragon, right? So your second turn is land. You've got no power at all. They go land, Shivan Dragon. It's your turn too, but you mana drain, and suddenly all of the gross start that they had, they've invested a lot of cards. They've gotten tons of jewelry in play, and they've got way more mana than you do, and the game feels super unfair. And suddenly the game feels totally unfair in reverse, right? You've taken an insane start, and the fact that you don't have time to disenchant or deal with all the artifact mana is addressed by the fact that you get this counter that delivers mana to you and temporarily puts you into the position that they were in on the previous turn. And so in formats where you've got broken mana, in my opinion, Mana Drain is one of the most important cards for keeping those formats in check. And if you remember back from the devolution of the 1v1 experiment, as it got worse and worse and worse, and the ban list just blew up out of control to 60 plus cards or whatever it was. One of the things that kicked it off was, what was so interesting was, and I can't remember the exact order, but basically they banned Strip Mine, which meant that you couldn't keep somebody sandbagging blue mana for a mana drain. You couldn't interact with that, and by killing a land and then making a play. So then they addressed that by banning Mana Drain, but then that meant that there was no punish for these extreme starts that you can get with Soul Ring and Crypt. So then they banned Mana So then they banned Crypt and Soul Ring, which meant that, and it just kept going and spiraling downhill, right? So there's a reason why all these cards actually, each individually are broken and gross and unfair, but when you put the right mix of broken, gross, and unfair together, you actually end up with a very fair and fun format. And in this case, my opponent got a heck of a start, obviously, with a Soul Ring draw, but they missed a land, and I noticed that, and because they missed a land, I'm able to severely punish them with a mana drain on the Soul Ring follow-up play, and then to tutor out a Strip Mine, I'm going to kill the Soul Ring, and of course, I'm going to play Jason. I'm going to bounce their creature. So if you see the tempo play here, it's strip the land, play Jace, bounce the creature. If they miss a land drop, then I get to start Jacing to find more mana, / Crucible of Worlds to replay the Strip Mine, and quickly build up mana with Jace there to bounce anything they play, and ultimately Mind Twist away their hand before they can recover. So my opponent scoops, and we move on to the last game for from 7-7, which is against Tabor Brazil, and it was oh, you're playing Breya, I concede. Opponent, fine. All right, so then I've got a bunch of games I had played on the 9th, and then this handful of games from the 10th. Now on the 9th, failed to mention this on the 7th because it didn't come up. On the 9th, I don't believe I'd made the Tails End switch. I may have, so if we see either counterspell, we'll know what's the case, but my opponent, Ruby 2, it's not Ruby 2's day, and they decide to quit right away instead of facing me. So we move on to the next game against the Rift. Hopefully plays this out. I don't know. There was a lot of concession early, so all right. Marin of Clan Nel Toth rather is my opponent. Is what I'm facing. And my opponent leads off with an Entomb for Spore Frog, and I couldn't be happier to see a Spore Frog right there, because if it was Entomb for Grizzlebrand, I have no way to interact with that, and that could just mean that I was going to lose right away. Although I have a fighting chance with the Winter Orb Urza draw, especially with Stoneforge, but this is just insane. This is one of those games where we get to express the power of Urza, which is pretty nice. Now watch what happens here. I get to Stoneforge into a sword, play the sword, tap the sword for mana and the construct, equip the sword, and attack with an equipped sword on Urza, untapping all of my lands, and then play Winter Orb. So did you see that I could do that? If you didn't, well, now you know. Very cool stuff, right? And then I tap my opponent's my Winter Orb for mana on my opponent's turn, and next turn all of my stuff untaps. My opponent's doesn't. So I get to play land, play Breya, right? Attack, untap all of my lands, and use them for mana if I want to. Probably sacking the Islet to draw a card and dig for more card draw. Potentially even just using Urza's ability. But then I get to untap all my lands a second time with the Winter Orb out, thanks to Urza. So this was a while back. Somebody had made the comment about I can't wait to break the parity on Winter Orb with Urza, and then I was like, holy smokes, I hadn't even thought about that. Because I was just thinking how insane Urza would be in this deck in general without the implications. So yeah, there is actually that exact scenario in action, and it's pretty incredible. All right, so I've got a heck of a start here. I'm playing against Joe C. Chill running Rakdos the Showstopper. My opponent does have a Vampiric Tutor into a Mana Crypt, into a Thran Dynamo, into a Felwar. So my opponent is bringing it. Fortunately, I have the right hand for that. I get to Duretti my opponent's. I trade my mana for 3 of theirs, but mine's a one-shot deal and hurts me. Theirs is reusable, so it's bad, but not the worst. And my opponent Chaos Warps away my Soul Ring, hitting mana. I don't agree with that play at all. As a matter of fact, they gave me the right color I needed, so I just impulse right back into a Soul Ring hilariously and set my board up this way. Deciding I'm not going to sack the Soul Ring, I'll let him to kill the Mana Crypt. I'll let him make a play here because I have Teferi and Toxic Deluge and Duretti all to follow up and clean up whatever it is my opponent tries to do here. Opponent, of course, you notice missed a land drop. So what's going to happen here is I'm going to tuck the Archfiend of Depravity, rather, into their deck, and I'm going to Duretti off their Mana Crypt. And then when they draw it, they're already having mana problems in a couple turns. They're going to draw an unplayable Archfiend. It's just going to get worse for them. And my opponent realizes this and concedes. Of course, if they hadn't, we have so much stuff going on with this hand. We've got Throne of the High City to draw extra cards and take a land off the board and set up Weathered Wayfarer. So if my opponent hit a land drop and then eventually did hit a land drop in their next 2 cards, well, I could then go get a Strip Mine followed by a Wasteland and reduce them back to 2 lands anyway. So pretty awesome stuff with Josie Chill there. Next game was against Step 7 Hen. I don't remember this one. My opponent's playing Queen Marchesa. And I have a pretty mediocre draw, but I keep it because it's got the ability to fix the color situation. Talisman off the top was real nice there. Opponent Vampirics early. I go ahead and kill a land right away. Because they Vampiric, they may have counted on whatever it was that they fetched. Unfortunately, my opponent then plays a Rakdos Carnarium, which I would have liked to have had removal for that. So I just muddle for a DT, and strip that as well. Opponent then goes land Mana Crypt, which is probably what they tutored for, and Night's Whispers. But I get a Dak Faden into play and steal their Mana Crypt. And at this point, I've taken out 5 of my opponent's mana sources and picked up 2 bonus mana sources. And as you can see, there's a slight discrepancy between how much mana my opponent has available and how much I have. While they do have 6 cards in hand, I've got 6 cards in play, and that's a much better place for them to be. So my opponent goes ahead and scoops it up. Obviously, again, Throne threatening to allow me to draw 2 cards per turn while I've created this stall scenario. So I'll be able to get Breya down and draw 2 cards per turn for the rest of the game, and it is totally over. So don't mind the concession there at all. That was a game from, we're still on 7-9, so a few more from there. Braxai is the next opponent. I'm very sorry for that. Playing Muldrotha the Gravetide. I've got a very nice hand if I can put it all together. Fortunately, Force of Will should keep me safe, and my opponent goes for a Sylvan, which I do have to force because Force is insane right there. So I tutored for a workshop. I don't know if you had seen that or if you thought perhaps I would go get a Soul Ring, and I could have seen, or a Mana Crypt, I could have seen an argument for that as well, but I thought Workshop made more sense because after it's done providing the mana to get the Lantern in play, it continues to provide mana for me via the Lantern that it just played. And of course, with my last card, I undo all of the damage that's been done from my Force of Will, 2 for 1ing me, my Imperial Seal, 2 for 1ing me, and my Enlightened Tutor, 2 for 1ing me. When I say 2 for 1ing me, I'm saying I threw away a card to get nothing, right? I threw away a card to shuffle my deck and put a card on top. And, so if I had 7 cards in hand and I played 7 Imperial Seals, at the end of all that, I would have a card on top and no cards in hand. So I would have gone down a card 7 times. For all I know, the card that I Imperial Sealed for was already on top, right? There's no way to know. So for all I know, this is 1 black, lose 2 life, discard itself, and do nothing. It could have done exactly what I was already going to get anyway. So these cards are not good in terms of card advantage, but realistically speaking, the chances that the card I wanted was on top were only like 1 in 80 something. And so I'm willing to improve those from 1 in 84 or whatever it is to 100% at the cost of a card, right? So that's why we run these. But the problem, of course, is the more of these types of cards we play, the worse the hand gets, and then the more it requires a refill. Fortunately, Necro is the ultimate refill and goes perfectly when you're tutoring for Workshop to play a Lantern. It's just also perfect. Force of Will, of course, also 2 for 1s me. I gain tempo in the fact that I can counterspell without spending mana, but I lose a card. The card I lost actually would have 2 for 1 me as well. You can see this hand was extremely poor when it comes to card advantage until I wasted 2 cards to fetch 7, at which point I won the game. So that's the thing about this deck, and it's part of the reason that you can play these kinds of tutors is that you are sacrificing cards with the expectation that it's going to pay off down the road. So we're on the new Mulligan system. I'm playing against Krenko, and I mulligan into this hand here. Feels pretty good. If my opponent has a Soul Ring, I've got a solution. I was kind of looking forward to playing it out. I realized after I did it, I put a Crucible Worlds on the bottom instead of the Workshop, not thinking it through correctly. I should have dumped the Workshop on the bottom from the new Mulligan and kept the Crucible. Then on this turn, if my opponent does nothing, I go Islet, I tap Islet Soul Ring, I copy the Soul Ring, getting a second one, tap that, and play Crucible instead of Workshop. And on the next turn, I can sack the Islet to draw a card and then replay it, trying to dig for a artifact mana so that I can get 2 blue into play. But at any rate, that would have been a lot smarter. Fortunately, my opponent just conceded, and so I didn't have to suffer any ill effects of bad decision making. But it could have turned out a lot better. You can forecast that I could have played that a lot better. So anyway, opponent Captain Babybeard lives up to the name, I guess. Sees a Breya or sees a End Project 2. I'm not sure which one's more threatening to this opponent. Probably the Breya. And goes ahead and concedes. They're playing a blue-white-green deck, and I had a heck of a draw. I would have really liked to have played that out. Anyway, Railroad Man 1990 here. I don't know if this opponent plays me or not either. Is playing the Locust God. I have another Savage draw. I lead off with turn 1 Soul Ring. I'm very excited about this hand. Opponent has turn 1 nothing. I get turn 2. I decide I'm going to Demonic for a Teferi and then tutor up a Force of Will so I can push the Teferi through because I figure that there's almost no way I can lose if I get a Teferi out against that opponent, and it gives me the ability to tuck their commander away, which means that I've got down the road, which means I've got a great way to deal with it. Of course, now I'm drawing 2 cards per turn. I get to actually use the tuck ability right away on a Howling Mine, unfortunately, but yeah, the next turn I develop, and it's totally crazy. I've got Mana Leak up. Force of Will, my opponent suspended a Wheel of Fate. So like in, I don't know, a million turns later, my opponent is going to try to play Wheel of Fate. I'm going to counter it, of course, because by then my hand will be a good size, and I won't exactly want to refill my opponent's hand. The cost of mine, more than likely. And anyway, it doesn't matter, though. My opponent just looks at the board state and realizes that the game is over, and indeed it is. The opponent's draw was not comparable. All right, so Railroad Man gets railroaded, and I move on to Jacko BCRNK 10. Jacko Brink? Not quite sure what that is. And I have another Savage draw. Like, I was drawing the most beautiful hands all night on the 9th, and my opponents just kept doing this. Before I can even see what their commander is, my opponent concedes, seeing what mine is, I guess. So, like, it's nice to get the wins and everything, I suppose, just for the record, but it would have been even nicer to do one of the most delightful things you can do in the format, which is play a turn 1 Soul Ring. Anyway, Jimmy Wang 1987 does decide to face me and stick around for it. He's playing Teferi Archmage here, and I run out this way, deciding that Workshop is less important than Strip Mine, and Strip Mine early allows me to buy some time and run out a ton of mana. I am going to lose some life here, but it seems to be worthwhile because it's going to guarantee that I can get that Duran Dynamo down, then run a Remand off of it, unless my opponent has mana up. But Jimmy Wang does not apparently want to deal with a draw that looks like this, even though I did miss a land drop, and the opponent decides to scoop it up, so okay. So we move on to J. Column, J. Column, and I never feel bad about beating mono blue, that's for sure. J. Golem decides not to play. So unfortunately, we just move on to the next game. I was starting to sense a train on the ninth there. So I run another game. It's Jimmy Wang, 1987 once again. Assuming that's the Jimmy's birthday there, I would place him at exactly 10 years my junior, so that's kind of cool. Anyway, I've got a Soul Ring start against Mono Blue, and this is exactly, incidentally, going back to that whole, bringing it up again in the 1v1 failed experiment, when they banned all the fast mana, once they banned the Moxes and the Soul Rings and everything, if you'll remember, they then had to ban a Mono Blue Commanders because Mono Blue was super toxic and miserable. It was being run everywhere. It was no fun to play against. I was at a point where I was running Red Elemental Blast and Pyroblast main deck, along with like Duresses and Thoughtseizes because Mono Blue was so toxic. And even then, sometimes I wouldn't win. It was just miserable to face. And why? And it's because primarily when you take out the things that destroy the Mono Blue deck, it's going to run rampant. So fast mana and strip mines and mind twists and stuff are things that Mono Blue doesn't typically have access to, and certainly doesn't have access to in the kind of reliability that multicolor decks have, because they don't have as many tutors in straight blue, and can't afford to play them either because they tap out for like a Fabricate to go get a mana crypt, then what do they do to deal with the threat that you play that follows it up? It's harder for them to tap out, right? So by taking all that out of the format, they just open it wide to Mono Blue, and I think Mono Blue should always be a tier 2 deck. It should always be a deck that's a threat and can win, but it should never be a tier 1 deck. It should never be a deck that's the threat, which completely dominates and warps the format, because frankly, it's miserably unfun when all you do is face Mono Blue all day, every day. Anyhow, but as you can see, I've got a fast mana draw. I'm playing against Mono Blue, and the Mono Blue deck does not feel like a threat, despite the fact that my opponent's deck has way more counterspells than me. I've got way more mana, and I can set this game up to put myself, and as you can see how important Strip Mine is right there, right? Put myself into a position. My opponent, of course, is going to mana drain here. It's a little painful. I was hoping it wouldn't be mana drain, but I'm going to run out Tezzeret anyway and orb my opponent down with this kind of artifact mana in play. This gives my opponent, if my opponent played a land, they only get to untap one land, so if they played a land, they'd have blue, blue, and 3 colorless, which is one less than Teferi. Teferi normally works around a Winter Orb, but they're 1 mana short because of the orb and because of the Strip Mine earlier. So now, otherwise they would have had 1 blue untapped into a second blue and been able to play Teferi, and this wouldn't have worked, and I would have been in big trouble. But because of the key cards that I just was talking about earlier against Mono Blue, the same weapons you need. So it's an irony of how, or maybe a beauty of the mathematics of Garfield and the early games, and or could just be luck. I don't know, but the package of Strip Mine and Mind Twist and Soul Ring and Moxes and Mana Drain, you put it all that stuff together, and you can see how it creates an interesting game where there's play and counterplay, and I delight in that. So anyway, I used Vindicate as bait. My opponent took the bait, and had they not, of course, they couldn't have countered Teferi anyway. And then Tezzeret, rather. And Tezzeret was able to prevent Teferi, and Teferi deck runs Static Orb. So this opponent actually is running a more powerful Winter Orb, incredibly busted with their Teferi. But they realize that I don't care that much about it because I've got an untap mechanism, and I'm already not planning to untap lands, and they're going to be stuck under it. And with all that going on, Jimmy Wang concedes. And that's what I like for Mono Blue to do when I face them. So AHD 2468 here is playing Maelstrom Wanderer, and I have a very good start. I was so excited with this hand, right? So this hand, you get first turn map, second turn, I'm sitting on Tail's End. If my opponent if I go first turn map, my opponent plays a fetch land and doesn't crack it, and I go second turn land pass, and they go end of turn fetch and I tails end it, oh, that would feel so good. On the other hand, if they go first turn Soul Ring, right, and I go second turn land, pass, and then they make a play that's legendary, well, I could counter that and then deck fade, and it feels so good. So I was excited about this hand because this hand was going to feel great. And then they scoop. And at this point, I was so tired of the join my game and concede crowd. I just stopped playing on the ninth. Fast forward to today, I want some more games, so I start playing, and my first game is against Dave, 25, 25, 2. I guess he ran out of fives. And he is playing Krav the Redeemed and Regna the Redeemer. And look at this insane start from my opponent. I've got first turn land. My opponent's got first turn threat and 5 mana on turn 2 in a deck that has effectively a hand size of 7 plus 2, whereas mine is 7 plus 1. Excuse me. But like I've been preaching all night, Mana Drain is the thing that balances out Mana Crypt. And my opponent runs out a 6 mana drop into the Mana Drain, and I get to get right back in the game, despite the fact that I'm getting beaten down with 7 mana worth of threats, and my opponent has way more mana than I do. All of a sudden, fairly quickly too, I am almost even on mana now, and I pass for the turn. And as a matter of fact, I am even while I was, until a Mana Vault came down. My opponent can then, which allows my opponent to then replay their commander or run out this giant 6-drop. Unfortunately for them, my Snapcaster Mage allows me to replay the... so I'm doing little Sensei's Divining Top trips because I want to draw a land next turn. So I've now put the Sensei's Divining Top lower in my deck. So replay the Mana Drain and repunish them for the acceleration off the Vault and Crypt that my opponent's been taking advantage of. And now that I've got my mana, I'm going to get my commander into play, I believe. Or at the very least, we're going to fabricate here. I'm going to produce more mana. Yeah, so that's what it was. I fabricated for Lotus in order to get Breya into play, but do it while maintaining rough mana parity with my opponent. I factor fiction here. My opponent makes a terrible split, gives me Duretti, which is what I wanted, plus 2 cards. You never want to give me the card I wanted plus 2. You should always try to just give me the card I want plus 1 or on its own if you can. I may have just taken Duretti in that situation by itself. Anyway, my opponent, I'm going to go ahead and take some damage here, but I draw a copy artifact on Lotus. So now I've actually turned a game where my opponent had 5 mana on turn 1 and a threat, and I had come into play tapped land. I've turned that game into a game where my opponent is behind on mana compared to me. And that is kind of incredible and very cool, I think. Anyway, I'm going to continue to develop and set myself up to draw extra cards. My opponent's commanders, they're not that interesting, and my opponent's deck, to be honest, isn't that interesting. It's just a bunch of angel stuff. Opponent gets a Soul Ring here for even more, completes the trifecta of insane mana ramp cards and scoops because they don't have any refill because they're playing their mana on a bunch of junky angels rather than cards that draw more cards and, you know, create the snowball effect where, like this deck does, where you just bury them. You start, you ramp your mana early and use it to start your engine, which produces more cards, and that of course finds you even more mana, which allows you to find even more cards, and so you just, it gets going, and you can see going from having 1/5 of the land of mana of your opponent to having double their mana almost. Pretty awesome, and it's very indicative of what this deck does, but it was double the mana, or roughly double the mana of an opponent who had an empty hand where I had almost 7 cards in hand if you actually factored in what was going to happen once I started playing those cards. So, alright, so new game against Pedari, and this, I've seen this a lot lately, Feather the Redeemed. I don't know why this is super popular. I'm not at all impressed by the card, but for some reason, people, a certain number of people seem to be very impressed by it because I've seen that card a ton lately. And I mean, it's fine by me. I don't find it to be very interesting at all. I think red-white is probably the most boring of all combinations of colors that I can imagine because it's kind of really good at board control, but it's terrible at mana development and terrible at yeah. So here my opponent just scoops. I'm able to set up an early. They gave me all kinds of time by playing a card that doesn't affect the board, and from there I just take over the game. But um, red white typically doesn't really have any card draw or very little card draw. It typically doesn't have any way to interact with um, much that your opponent does unless they do very specific things. So it's great at disenchanting things and killing creatures, and pretty good at killing lands as well. But that's if you don't go the land kill route. Like land kill is the only way you can actually disrupt your opponent's game in a way that's proactive rather than reactive. So as an example of proactive disruption of your opponent's game, you kill their mana to prevent them from getting their game off the board. My opponent here playing the Heb the Eternal looks at my start and concedes, and I don't have a problem with that. Excuse me. So anyway, but as an example of proactive control of your opponent's game, if you kill all their lands or you kill their hand, or you play cards that invalidate, like Moat against a deck with a bunch of grizzly bears, you aggressively prevent them from enacting their game plan. It's a lot better than defensively, reactively doing it. Reactive cards like Swords to Plowshares are okay, but Moat is better, right? The difference is if you look at the cost, reactive cards tend to be cheap, and so they're very good for getting you past the early game so you can get to the point in the game when you can play the proactive cards without being dead on board. All right, so my opponent's got a pretty good start, but I'm kind of sandbagging over here and setting up for this really nasty turn. Opponent has a Crucible of Worlds, but of course it was a known threat, so it gives me time to prep a very gnarly turn here in which I steal their commander, destroy their Crucible, orb away all of their lands, and my opponent concedes, which is awesome. I was going to be able to go get Stoneforge into Sword of Feast and Famine and throw it on Gitrog eventually here. And if you'll notice, by the way, I have a blue enchantment and I do not play the blue-red sword. That is kind of a thing that's nice. I don't ever have to worry about knocking my own enchantments off. So I don't create these non-combos in my deck to the maximum extent possible. You always want your cards to synergize really well. Like Sword of Feast of Famine is such a good combo with Winter Orb, for example. But you also want another join and quit player from the next day even. But you also want to avoid the reverse anti-synergy, or what my friend used to call nombos, right? Not a combo. So you want to avoid those as much as possible as well. Basically, all I'm getting at is that your deck should, and I mean, when I say avoid as much as possible, I mean strongly avoid playing cards that fight with each other, and strongly prefer playing cards that synergize with each other is important. All right, so unfortunately here I've got to go fetch a scrub land. I don't really like fetching non-blue lands, but because I'm missing both white and black, I figured that was the play here. Fortunately, on the other hand, it's another game we will get to see Urza do the amazing things that Urza does. So my opponent playing a big green deck with Roshin Meanderer. Fortunately, I mean, good for me, I have a 2-mana counter, so I keep it off the board long enough to buy some time, and then Urza comes down, and look at how much I spent 4 mana and then used Urza to play into Muzawa's Jitte and equip it, which means Urza costs 0 right there for all intents and purposes. And on the next turn, my 0 mana Urza, who produced 4 blue, or my 4 mana Urza, who produced 4 blue, is now going to tap for an insane amount of mana. Also, I get to lay incredible beatdowns. That is an 8/8 after all. As you can see, there's just something really gross going on here, which is that I get to tap the flyer that Breya made for a blue so it can equip a Skull Clamp. and draw me cards, and tap the next flyer so it can equip a Skull Clamp and draw me cards. Then I can tap the Skull Clamp for mana, as well as the Jitte, the Breya, the Crucible, and the Mox Opal. Plus, I haven't played a land yet. So what's going to happen is, my opponent conceded, of course, but I can tap, or have I played? No, I have played a land. I'm sorry. But what's going to happen is I'm going to tap Jitte, Breya, Crucible, Mox, Skull Clamp, and play Treachery, stealing this big thing. Untap all 5 of my lands. Wasteland away their Nykthos, leaving them with just the 3 mana in play, right? Jitte down their Llanowar Elves and play a Jace. Completely insane, and all because Urza generates absolutely gross amounts of mana while providing me the ability to hit my opponent in the face for 8 damage plus per turn. Totally nuts card. So glad it was suggested, and I think honestly the Urza's functionality and power is probably the highlight of this video. So satisfied with that card. I mean, it seemed like an obvious card for Breya, but it's one of those ones where you go, yeah, duh, of course it goes in Breya. I mean, look what it does, right? It taps artifacts for mana. This thing makes 3. It's an artifact that makes 2 more artifacts, and you're playing blue. But that's the knee-jerk response. Actually getting it into play and feeling how good it feels to play Urza and what it does for the board, how it allowed Crucible Worlds to replay a land and then tap for mana, effectively turning Crucible Worlds into 2 Mox Sapphires, as well as turning a Skull Clamp and a Skull Clamp and a Sword into mana sources or whatever it was. Like, just crazy. And then in the other game, of course, it was tapping to an orb. Urza is just a nutty upgrade. And then all that, plus it's a human, so it gets to run off of the Cavern of Souls. Just amazing. So hopefully you enjoyed this video. I realize I talked quite a bit more in this than I usually talk a lot, but but I talk quite a bit more in this rather than mostly focusing on gameplay. We still haven't gotten to see Tails End actually do what I want it to do, so I'll have to give that some more time and feel it out, but I have a pretty strong hunch that it's a pretty good card and will most likely stick around, where Archmage's Charm just a bit too clunky and probably won't. And if that ends up being the case, I'm happy. One of the things that's super cool about Control, just want to throw this in, is that Control should constantly, a good, like, basically the deck style Control. Its unique feature, one of the things that's unique about it anyway, is that classically the deck always incorporates, it's 2 things really. One, it incorporates the tools that you want to use against it to beat it. So if you notice, I was talking about how Strip Mine and Mind Twist and Soul Ring are really good counters to Mana Drain. Like, it's a way of punishing Mana Drain decks. But they're also tools in Mana Drain decks. And that's one of the classic frustrations, I suppose, but I find it to be beautiful, of the deck, is that when you make a card that you say, okay, well, here's what we'll do. We'll make a card that'll make creatures uncounterable, and that'll make Mana Drain decks suffer. And then I go, oh, sweet. Now I can play Cavern of Souls, and I can be an aggressive Mana Drain deck whereas I can play better creatures than my opponent that they can't counter, and then just use Mana Drains to protect my board, rather than Mana Drains to disrupt their creatures, who I don't care as much about, because my creatures are superior. So it's one of those deals where you make a weapon against the deck, you say, oh, Dak Faden will severely punish a artifact-heavy deck like this, and Breya, and say, oh, well, brilliant, Dak Faden, that's going to be wonderful. Unless the card is mono-green, basically, you're probably not doing yourself any favors, because if it's good enough and playable, even if it's a card as hard to cast as Necro, it makes its way into the deck. So it ends up being a highlight reel of all the cards that really work, right, in Magic. And one of the things that's cool to me is that if you actually look at the number of, I wish we could sort by set. I don't think we can. Yeah, see, they set and collector number. I don't know what the heck that is. I wish I would take collector number out and just say sort by set and make that an option. I would love that. And what you would see with this stack is you would see cards from almost every set throughout Magic's history, and probably from every block and nearly every set. And that's just an amazing thing. I mean, we even have Merchant Scroll, which is like a card from one of the worst sets in history, right? So if you actually look where Merchant Scroll came from, um, there's almost no usable cards in that set, but there is one, and it's in this deck, right? So it's one of the coolest things about this deck too is that you just get an incredible variety throughout Magic's history, all card types. You get to affect so many different aspects of the game. You know, Throne of the High City allowing you to play the Monarch game in a control deck. It's just it's just such a neat thing. So if you enjoy that and appreciate it as much as I do, the fact that your threats are enchantments, your threats are your graveyard, your threats are going after the hand, your threats are control effects, your threats are mana destruction, reusable creature removal and control, and uh, uncounterable threats that you can use to beat your opponent down with things like Stoneforge making artifacts uncounterable against your opponent, and Cavern of Souls making creatures uncounterable, not all artifacts, but the one that you need, right? Um, it's just so cool. So hopefully you've enjoyed all the talking because I'm geeking out on my own deck. I've been gone for almost a month and haven't had a chance to do this, and it's so fun to just come back and pick it up again and be reminded of why this is one of the greatest games ever invented. So thank you very much for watching. Hope you liked this video. And next one I expect will be a lot more focused on gameplay. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next time.